Have you ever thought about, like, how grown-ups are basically just giant kids?
Mhm.
I mean, yeah, sure, we have mortgages and bills and responsibilities, but
Right.
deep down,
Yeah.
are we really all that different from, like, when we were younger?
Mm.
Today, we are going to take a deep dive into that question.
Okay.
And we'll be looking at some really fascinating articles by Joshua Rothman from The New Yorker.
Okay.
One is called Are Grown-Ups Just Giant Kids? And the other is Are You the Same Person You Used to Be?
Cool.
And we're also going to be taking a look at the whole idea of childhood and how that's changed over time. And we'll
Okay.
be using this book called Centuries of Childhood by Philippe Ariès for that.
It's funny how we kind of use that phrase, like grown-ups are just giant kids, almost like it's a joke.
Yeah.
But then when you actually start to like peel back the layers on that,
Yeah.
it gets really complex and interesting.
Totally.
Yeah.
What I think is so cool is that Rothman, he doesn't just like point out the funny surface level stuff.
Right.
Like, oh, adults love candy, just like kids do.
Yeah.
But he goes deeper than that. He
Yeah.
looks at those like underlying needs and motivations that seem to stay with us no matter how old we get.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He talks about our desire for treats.
Uh-huh.
You know, little kids go nuts for candy.
Totally.
But like, haven't we all, as adults waited in line for like the newest trendy pastry or whatever?
Oh, yeah.
Like maybe our tastes get a little more sophisticated,
Yeah.
but that basic drive is kind of the same.
It's so true.
Yeah.
And what about that feeling of wanting to belong?
Hmm.
Like, wanting to be part of the group.
Right.
That's like such a classic kid thing.
Yeah.
But I think it stays with us even as adults,
Yeah.
whether it's at work or in our social circles. Like everybody wants to feel like they fit in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Rothman also talks about how both kids and adults actually crave solitude sometimes too.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, like we need time to recharge, process our thoughts and feelings.
Yeah.
It's like we're always trying to find that balance between connection and independence.
Right.
No matter how old we are.
I like that. It's a
Yeah.
constant.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He even talks about how both kids and adults
Yeah.
deal with really complicated emotions like
Yeah.
fear of death.
Yeah.
It might manifest differently,
Right.
but that sense of mortality, like, that's something we all have to grapple with.
We do.
Do you think he's onto something with all these, like, parallels?
I do.
Yeah.
And what makes Rothman's work so interesting to me is he talks about how you can use this lens,
Okay.
this adult or giant kids lens, to actually like understand other people better.
Interesting.
Think about it.
Okay.
Like that coworker who just flips out about being left off an email.
Right.
Maybe they're just like channeling their inner child
Uh-huh.
who got left out of some game or something.
That's such a helpful way to reframe things.
Yeah.
Like, instead of getting frustrated or annoyed, you can kind of chuckle to yourself and be like,
That's right.
oh, they're just having a little kid moment.
Exactly. It's not about like, excusing bad behavior.
Right.
But it can help us, be more understanding and approach things with more empathy.
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
So, like, we're going to look at how the concept of childhood itself has changed over time.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where Philippe Ariès comes in
Okay.
with his book, Centuries of Childhood.
Yeah.
So his argument, basically,
Yeah.
is that childhood as we know it today is like a
Uh-huh.
fairly recent invention.
Really?
Yeah.
That's a controversial idea.
It is.
For sure.
Yeah.
He's basically saying that in medieval times,
Okay.
children were pretty much seen as miniature adults.
So, like, are you telling me that my image of, like, little kids running around and playing in fields?
Well,
Yeah.
not quite.
Okay.
But, Arias points to different things.
Okay.
Like the artwork from that era often showed children in adult clothing and with like adult proportions.
Interesting.
And societal norms around childhood were just totally different. Like, especially when it came to things like, work and sexuality.
So he's saying this whole thing about childhood, like
Yeah.
that it's this protected, innocent phase of life.
Exactly.
It's something that developed over time.
Right.
Interesting.
And he argues that the rise of institutions like schools,
Yeah.
which kind of separated children from adults,
Uh-huh.
really played a big role in that.
Makes you wonder, like, how much of what we just assume is normal for kids
Right.
is really just a product of, like, our own time and our own culture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think he's being a little extreme, though, with
Oh.
this whole idea that childhood basically didn't exist before, like, the 15th century?
Some historians definitely disagree with Arias.
Okay.
They say that medieval society didn't recognize childhood.
Okay.
just in different ways with different expectations.
Yeah. Gotcha.
But I think even if he's exaggerating a little,
Yeah.
he raises this really important point,
Uh-huh.
which is that our ideas about childhood
Yeah.
are shaped by social forces,
Mm.
not just biological realities.
So it's not as simple as just saying kids will be kids.
Oh.
Because what even makes someone a kid has
Yeah.
changed so much over time.
Exactly.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And that really connects to our main question.
Mm.
If our understanding of childhood is so fluid
Yeah.
and always changing,
Right.
then what does that say about the supposed line between kids and adults?
Right.
It's like maybe those lines are a lot blurrier
Could be.
than we think.
Yeah.
And, you know, Rothman also brings in some really fascinating scientific research.
Okay.
He talks about this thing called the Dunedin study,
Mm.
which followed over 1,000 kids for decades
Wow.
to track their development from childhood into adulthood.
That's a lot of data.
Yeah.
The Dunedin study gives us some really important clues about personality and whether we basically change or stay the same over time.
Okay, cool. So how does this study connect to the idea that grown-ups might just be giant kids?
Well, one of the key things they found
Yeah.
was that certain temperaments, like the behavioral patterns we show early on in life,
Uh-huh.
can actually last into adulthood.
Oh, wow.
Things like being shy or outgoing,
Right.
or being prone to risk-taking.
Interesting.
These aren't just phases.
Okay.
They can really affect our choices and experiences throughout our lives.
So that little kid who's always like pushing the boundaries and testing limits,
Exactly.
they might grow up to be like some adventurous entrepreneur always looking for a new challenge.
Exactly. And then on the other hand, you have that quiet, introspective kid.
Right.
And they might be drawn to more solitary pursuits as adults.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I love this idea of niche picking. Like the idea that we actually gravitate towards environments that just reinforce our tendencies.
Right. It's like we're creating our own self-fulfilling prophecies
Yeah.
based on those early temperaments.
And that brings us back to the question of how much we actually change over time.
It does.
If our personalities as adults are so influenced by who we were as kids,
Right.
does that mean we're essentially the same person, just with more years under our belts and more responsibilities?
It's a good question.
Now, that's a question I want to unpack a little bit more.
Okay.
But before we do that, I want to turn it over to our listeners for a second.
Okay.
I want you to think about your own childhood.
Yeah.
What were you like as a kid?
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the things that you loved
Oh.
or things that you struggled with?
Yeah.
And do you see any like echoes of that younger self in who you are today?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really amazing, how much of our adult lives we can trace back to those early experiences.
Right.
And it's not just about like specific behaviors or whatever.
Uh-huh.
It's also about those stories that we create about ourselves. Rothman talks about this idea of like continuers and dividers.
Okay, remind me what those are all about again.
So continuers are the people who see like a really strong connection to their past selves.
Mm-hmm.
Like their life feels like one continuous flow,
Okay.
a story with clear chapters,
Uh-huh.
all building on each other.
Okay.
And then you have the dividers.
Yeah.
And they see their lives as more like fragmented,
Mm-hmm.
with these like distinct breaks and shifts in their identity,
Okay.
almost like they've been multiple different people over time.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
Like it's almost like a tapestry. The
Right.
continuers see their lives as like woven together with one long thread.
Yeah.
And then the dividers see it as like all these different patches of color and texture all kind of sewn together.
That's a great way to picture it.
Yeah.
And Rothman, he illustrates these ideas with these two guys,
Yeah.
both named Tim.
Okay.
One is a classic continuer.
Okay.
Actually, he's Rothman's father-in-law.
Oh, cool.
And he's always been like this super jovial, playful guy.
Okay.
From his 20s to his 70s, his personality and his interests, they've pretty much stayed the same.
Wow.
He loves reading history, especially World War II, and sports.
So for him, it's like looking back and seeing the straight line,
Exactly.
connecting who he was then to who he is now.
Exactly.
That's wild.
Now, the second Tim,
Okay.
this is one of Rothman's high school friends.
Okay.
He sees his life as this series of like radical transformations.
Oh, wow.
So he was bullied for being skinny when he was a kid.
Mm.
Then he had this huge growth spurt.
Uh-huh.
and became this like athletic auction hero type.
Okay.
He's been into physics, philosophy, neuroscience.
Wow.
He was even a Marine for a while.
No way.
Yeah, then went into finance, and now he's doing computer science.
This guy sounds like a chameleon.
He does.
Like constantly changing colors and adapting to
Yeah.
new environments.
And he really embraces that.
Hmm.
He even told his mom when he was 13.
Okay.
She was a psychiatrist.
Oh, uh-huh.
He was like so unhappy. He said he would never stop changing.
Wow.
And he's kept that promise.
That's intense.
Yeah. So for this Tim, looking back is like flipping through a photo album
Right.
of completely different people.
It's so interesting, though,
It is.
because both of these Tims seem to have found a way to, like, thrive, despite their completely opposite approaches to life.
Yeah, and it makes you think,
Yeah.
like, what does it really mean
Right.
to live a successful life or a meaningful life?
Exactly.
Is it about staying true to your core self?
Hmm.
Or is it about embracing change and reinvention?
Maybe it's not about choosing one or the other. Maybe there's value in both, like, the continuer and the divider perspectives.
I think so too.
Yeah.
And Rothman seems to agree.
Yeah.
It's like both approaches have their own pluses and minuses.
Okay.
The continuers have this really deep sense of self,
Uh-huh.
this groundedness in their own history.
Right.
But they might also risk getting stuck
Okay.
or resisting new experiences.
That's true.
Yeah, and then the dividers.
Yeah.
They're always pushing boundaries,
Ah.
exploring new parts of themselves.
Right.
But they might struggle with feeling grounded
Mhm.
or having a clear idea of who they really are.
Yeah, it makes you think about, like, which one you relate to more.
It does.
Right.
Yeah, and it's not like a fixed thing either.
Sure.
Like you might find yourself feeling more like a continuer sometimes
Right.
and then more like a divider at other times.
It probably changes
Yeah.
throughout your life.
Yeah. Have you ever had like periods where you felt like a totally different person
Oh, yeah.
than you were before?
Definitely.
Yeah. Or are there some like core things about you
Mm-hmm.
that have always stayed the same?
Yeah, I think that's what's so cool about Rothman's work.
Yeah,
It really makes you, like, examine your own story
it does.
and think about how you make sense of your journey through life.
Exactly. And those stories we tell ourselves,
Mm.
they don't just reflect who we are. They actually shape who we become.
It's like a feedback loop.
Exactly.
I love that.
Yeah.
So even if you're, like, usually a continuer,
Yeah.
maybe it's worth trying to look at your life as a divider for a little while.
What if you did that?
Yeah, what new things might you see
Yeah.
if you thought about your life as these different chapters or transformations?
What parts of yourself might you discover
Mm.
or even choose to like let go of?
And on the other side,
Yeah.
if you're normally a divider,
Uh-huh.
what happens when you look for the things that have stayed the same?
Hmm.
Like, even through all those changes.
You might be surprised
Yeah.
to find that there's actually more consistency than you thought.
Right.
It's like recognizing that same melody
Okay.
that plays throughout a whole symphony,
Uh-huh.
even though the tempo and the instruments change.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's like we're each composing our own life symphony
We are.
with all the different parts. The
Right.
quiet moments, the bursts of energy, maybe even some, like, off-key notes here and there.
Yeah. It's all part of it.
Exactly. And I think that's the beauty of it.
I agree.
Like,
on that.
embracing the whole experience.
That's all part of the journey.
Yeah. So as we, like, wrap up this part of our deep dive into whether grown-ups are just giant kids,
Okay.
I'm curious, what do you think is, like, the main thing you hope our listeners will take away from this?
I think the biggest takeaway
Yeah.
is that there isn't just one right answer. You know, we're always changing.
Right.
Our understanding of ourselves is always evolving.
That's okay.
It is. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's about asking questions
Yeah.
and exploring and
Yeah.
embracing all that complexity.
Yeah.
That's how
Yeah.
we grow and learn.
You know, it's funny, as we've been talking about all these different ways of looking at ourselves,
Yeah.
it makes me wonder if maybe the real question isn't about whether we change or stay the same. It's more about, like,
Yeah.
how do we make sense of that tension between the two?
It's like we're always trying to balance who we were with who we're becoming.
Exactly. And it's, like you said earlier, maybe it's more about the journey than, like, actually finding an answer.
Maybe so.
And Rothman kind of hints at this too.
Yeah.
He doesn't give us a nice, neat conclusion.
Yep.
Instead, he leaves us with this challenge.
Oh, yeah.
He says, imagine you usually see yourself as a continuer.
Okay.
What would happen if you looked at your life through the eyes of a divider for a day, and
Mhm.
vice versa?
It's like putting on a different pair of glasses and suddenly seeing your whole life story differently.
Right. It can help us, like, challenge our assumptions,
Totally.
maybe even see some hidden patterns,
Yeah.
and appreciate how complex we really are.
It's a good point.
Like, imagine you've always focused on how much you've stayed the same, all those core things about you that haven't changed.
Yeah.
And then you suddenly start thinking about all the ways you've transformed.
Right. Like all those different versions of yourself that you've left behind. It could be a real eye-opener.
Yeah.
You might start to see those big turning points in your life as like these moments that helped you grow and evolve.
And you might even start to appreciate who you've become even more.
Yeah.
Because you realize how much courage it took to, like, shed those old skins and embrace new possibilities.
I like that.
And what about the other side of that?
Okay.
If you usually see your life as a bunch of separate chapters, what happens when you try to find the things that have connected them all?
You might realize that there's actually more consistency there than you thought.
Right. Like maybe there are some underlying values or beliefs.
Oh, exactly. Like a thread that runs through all those different chapters.
I love that analogy. It's like we're all creating our own life symphony.
Right. With all the different movements.
That's with quiet moments and bursts of energy.
Totally. And maybe even a few like dissonant chords.
Exactly. It's all part of it.
It is.
So as we wrap up this whole deep dive into whether grown-ups are just giant kids, what do you think is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
I think it's that there's no easy answer.
Right.
We're always changing.
Yeah.
And our understanding of ourselves is always evolving.
It's a process.
It is.
And it's okay that it's messy.
Yeah. Embrace the mess.
Exactly. It's all about asking questions.
Yeah.
Exploring and accepting that it's complicated.
That's how we grow and learn.
I think that's a great place to leave it.
Yeah.
So to all of our listeners out there,
Yeah.
keep asking those big questions.
Right.
Keep embracing the messiness of your own journey.
Absolutely.
And remember,
Yeah.
no matter how grown up you might seem,
Yeah.
never lose that curiosity and that sense of wonder.
Right.
Because you know what? Even grown-ups can still find joy in the simplest things.
That's the truth.